Hi, I'm Warren Sprouse, and you are on the Bible Forum. I have the sad duty this evening. This is the third or fourth Sunday in October. I can't keep track of them, 2018. And I have the privilege, I guess, or maybe on a negative side, there's another word for it, to tell you what's going on. What every godless American has feared for the last, what, 60 some years has just happened. The Alabama Supreme Court has just ruled that an unborn baby is a person under the law, and is entitled to the full protection of the law, meaning you can't just kill it because you don't want it. The death of that little person can be punished with execution. If that's not enough, in a special occurrence, Justice Tom Parker has called on the U.S. Supreme Court to revisit Roe v. Wade. He wrote, quote, "I write specially to expound upon the principles presented in the main opinion and to note the continued legal anomaly and logical fallacy that is Roe v. Wade. Furthermore, quote, I urge the United States Supreme Court to overrule this increasingly isolated exception to the rights of unborn children," end of quote. He further asserted that Roe v. Wade is a completely, quote, created exception to the law, both natural law and common law of states, end of quote. At issue was a case wherein a man murdered a pregnant woman. He is being charged with the murder of two persons. Her name is Erica Phillips, and it's her and her unborn child which is in question. Of course, this is just exactly what the godless have always feared regarding Roe v. Wade. It's why they put up such a fuss about Judge Kavanaugh. And why? Because they know that this is logical. This is natural. This is right. Here's a woman with a baby in her womb, a viable human being in development, and you just kill it. Got a movie in the theaters now, but this Philadelphia Dr. Gosnell, and they're talking about all the things he did, and it is gross. It is worse than we were even told. But godless people don't want abortion on demand to be done away with. And they have a serious problem with revisiting Roe v. Wade, because godless people have a problem with, well, God, or they wouldn't be godless. He said, well, these people are actually Christian. No, they go to churches and they say these nice little words, and they actually have a Bible, but watch how they live. Christian is as Christian does every time. You got a Christian you work with and you know them to be a liar. They listen or tell dirty stories. They cheat the company they work for. And they do this year in and year out. Next time they tell you about their church and about their faith, laugh at them. Explain to them that they are fooling themselves. Christians do not do this stuff. Our national culture, our society has undergone a sea change in the last 60 years. During World War II, every American prayed for victory over Germany and Japan, as well as for the men and women fighting and dying in that senseless war. In 2018, a significant and highly public minority are fighting with every tool at their disposal to turn America into the Barbary Coast. Now, you might think that's an extreme characterization, but it's not as extreme as you might think. In many ways, the pirate-infested Barbary Coast was more civilized than this crowd. They chase people around hotels, around restaurants, and harass them so they can't eat their meals. They go out on the street. If one of these people show up, or if there's just any kind of a person that wants to do something decent or wrong, they go out there and they start beating on people. At the Barbary Coast, at least they had hard, fast laws. You didn't have to agree with them, but they were there and imposed penalties that were not negotiable. Everybody knew what the rules were. In America, it depends on what state you live in. It depends on what judge you get. It depends whether or not you will get established justice or some modification thereof. And if you get the right lawyer, they can overwhelm the system long enough and it'll just go away. And the streets of our now liberal cities today are awash in blood. In Detroit, violent crime is 5 times the national average. Detroit is number 1 in violent crimes. Chicago is almost 4 times the national average. Chicago gets a lot of press, but doesn't show up in the top 15 dangerous cities. Gary, Indiana is more dangerous than Chicago, 4 times as dangerous. Berkeley, California is more dangerous. 15 violent crimes per 1,000 residents. Washington, D.C. is almost 4 times as dangerous. Oakland, California, more than 3 times. By comparison, New York City is 26% lower than the average. Phoenix, Arizona, 83% lower than the national average. The low-end cities are cities like Plano, Texas, Orange, California, Peoria, Arizona, not Illinois. The more conservative cities range between 1.5 times to average. They're on the low end of the spectrum. And what makes the difference? Largely it's politics. If the laws are on the books, and the laws on the books were enforced without bias and enforced faithfully, if the leaders were to stop playing favorites, things would change. The wealthy, the influential, the stereotypical TV images, the social engineering, all of that factors in. We all know that the liberal, and today liberal is just another word for socialistic, politicians and community leaders, as a euphemism all by itself, have been working for decades to level the playing field. Their words. But what they mean is they want you to stop penalizing people who can't help themselves, who can't help that they are having these problems because they're just poor. If a poor person, especially a person of color, runs afoul of the law, it's automatically not their fault. Actually, it's automatically my fault. Why? Well, partly it's bad optics. But also because you made them this way. Your wealth, your privilege, you're keeping them down. You discriminated against them simply because they were of a different color. They call it race, but we all know there's only one race. It's called Homo sapien. The liberals created a class-conscious, class-envy situation every chance they got, everywhere they could. Then they proceeded to pass laws to protect that class from the law. You can't treat them the same as you treat everybody else. In nature, it's the survival of the fittest. In society, it's achievement by ability and initiative. And the liberals have taken both of these away. None of that works anymore. And they did it by dumbing down the educational system so that most Americans don't even know this is happening. They don't get it. They created an entitled category of people. And they're not all people of color. And then they enrich themselves by defending this artificial category against people who truly wanted to help that category do better. Illustration. What happens if you give a child everything they need and most of what they want? Well, what happens is they do not progress. And this is the essence of the progressive social liberal policy. This is the essence of pandering, primping, providing, and then using them to enrich and to empower you. They are feeding themselves on your misery that they work to create. And this stuff ought to be a crime. It ought to be a crime punishable by requiring the enablers to walk in the shoes of these people for about 20 years. See how they like it. The argument here in Roe v. Wade is that Baby Doe, back in 1972-3, had just as much a right to life as did the mother that was killed. Mr. Phillips was therefore sentenced to death for the murder of two persons, Erica and Baby Doe, because they were equally persons. The judge remarked in his judicial statements that this, quote, judicially created exception of Roe v. Wade is an aberration to the natural law and common law of the states. In his decision to reject Mr. Phillips' arguments that Baby Doe was not a person under Alabama law, he noted the Alabama court's opinion stated, quote, obvious truth that unborn children are people and thus entitled to the full protection of the law, end of quote. And so Mr. Phillips was sentenced to death by execution. The state Supreme Court affirmed the sentence, rejecting claims that Phillips could not be sentenced for the unborn child's death because the child was not a person. So we have an issue here. What do we do when this sort of thing happens? We take it to the U.S. Supreme Court. They decide. Justice Harry Blackmun, who wrote the majority opinion in Roe v. Wade, indicated the justices did not have the scientific evidence to determine if an unborn baby is a person, and personhood is the foundation of the case. That was an honest statement. They did not have proof. And so they erred in the majority decision on the side of a brutal death based on supposition, imaginative drawings. Justice Blackmun further wrote, if the suggestion of personhood of the preborn is established, the abortion rights case, of course, collapses. For the fetus's right to life is then guaranteed specifically by the 14th Amendment. And currently, the Alabama ruling is not the only one to point out the U.S. Supreme Court that Roe was wrongly decided. In August, the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals struck down an Alabama law banning the gruesome second trimester abortion procedure in which limbs are removed from a baby's body in the womb. Is this why the left works so hard to keep Kavanaugh off the bench? And why did we not know any of this then? At the time, Alabama Chief Judge Ed Carnes lamented in his opinion that he was bound by the U.S. Supreme Court precedent to rule against the state, writing that, quote, dismemberment, end of quote, is the best description of the procedure, which clinically is known as dilation and extraction, a D&E. He said, quote, in our judicial system there is only one Supreme Court and we are not it, calling the High Court's history of abortion rulings, quote, an aberration of constitutional law. And Alabama Judge Joel Dubina wrote separately to express his agreement with Supreme Court Justices Clarence Thomas, Antonin Scalia, and in Gonzalez versus Carhart, in which Thomas wrote, I write separately to reiterate my view that the court's abortion jurisprudence, included in Planned Parenthood's versus Casey and Roe versus Wade, has no basis in the Constitution. Additionally, he wrote, the problem I have, as noted in the Chief Judge's opinion, is that I am not on the Supreme Court. As a federal appellate judge, I am bound by my oath to follow all the Supreme Court's precedents, whether I agree with them or not. He wrote, this case involves a method of abortion that is clinically referred to as dilation and evacuation, or dismemberment abortion, as the state less clinically calls it. That name is more accurate because the method involves tearing apart, extracting piece by piece from the uterus that which was, until then, a living unborn child. End of quote. A year ago, 8 members of the Alabama Supreme Court revived a wrongful death claim against the physician who performed a late-term abortion, observing that what was at stake was a pre-viable unborn child. That ruling set the state in direct conflict with Roe versus Wade. The Alabama judges at the time criticized the Roe decision's incoherent standard of viability. The newest opinion notes that Alabama law states an unborn child is a person under the state's intentional murder statute. As an aside, according to Liberty Counsel, Justice Parker wrote separately to emphasize how broadly and consistently the law and judicial decisions in Alabama and around the country protect the rights of unborn children. This, Justice Parker said, contrasts with the continued legal anomaly and logical fallacy that is Roe v. Wade. In his opinion, Parker called the Supreme Court to act, writing, it is my hope and prayer that the United States Supreme Court will take note of the crescendoing chorus of the laws of the states in which unborn children are given full legal protection and allow the states to recognize and defend the inalienable right to life possessed by every unborn child, even when that right must trump the right of a woman to obtain the abortion. Here's an argument for states' rights. Let people live where they want. He said in ensuring broad legal protections for unborn children, including under Alabama's capital murder statutes, quote, we affirm once again that unborn children are persons with value and dignity equal to that of all persons, end of quote. We hear the horrible descriptions of the so-called dismemberment of Jamal Khashoggi over there in Turkey, and every breathing person just naturally shudders inside. And yet every day in America, helpless, preborn children are dismembered while they are still alive, capable of feeling pain. Baby Doe had just as much right to life as did his or her mother, Erica Phillips. This ruling, quote, stands as an indictment against the United States Supreme Court. The only way it can continue is if the U.S. Supreme Court justices, quote, insist against all scientific evidence and reason that unborn children are not human. Let me add, that's what they did in 1972. They were provided with drawings of what these little pre-born children look like in various stages. We now know that was bogus. Some of us knew it then. It was possible to know it then. Didn't want to know it. Now you know what was such a big deal about Kavanaugh getting on that bench. It's all about the liberals' right to kill people that you can't see. These are not nice people.